Okay, so, as a philosopher, you've probably spent a good amount of time thinking about what's real.
Yeah.
Like really real.
Yeah, the big questions, right?
Yeah, exactly. What's the self and what does it mean to exist even?
Right.
And today we're going to jump into this really interesting world, and I think for a lot of people, the overlooked world of James Ward,
Oh, yeah?
a British idealist who had some really fascinating answers to these questions.
He did, and that's what we're going to do today. Go on a deep dive into the core ideas of James Ward.
Yes.
And he was a thinker, really active in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Okay.
And what he really tried to do was bridge what might seem like opposite viewpoints.
Okay.
Idealism, the idea that reality is basically mental and a pluralistic view,
Yeah.
which says the universe is made up of lots of independent things.
Okay. So trying to bring those two together.
Trying to find a way to connect them.
That's a big task.
It is.
So James Ward, born in 1843, died in 1925.
Okay.
Kind of stands as a significant but maybe a little bit shadowed figure within British idealism.
Yeah, but
A movement that also included these giants like T.H. Green and F.H. Bradley.
oh, huge names. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And maybe not as recognizable a name today,
Not as much as those two.
but he was really respected in his time.
Oh, yeah, he had a lot of clout in the philosophical circles back then.
Okay, so to really understand Ward's project,
Yeah.
it's super important to understand the whole philosophical world that he was working in.
Absolutely. We got to set the stage.
Yeah.
And British idealism was really shaped by these thinkers, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel.
Okay, big names.
Yeah, they subscribed to this thing called absolute idealism.
Okay.
It's the idea that reality at its core is a single unified consciousness or even a cosmic experience.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit.
Okay.
This absolute idealism was kind of a response to materialism becoming so popular.
Right. The idea that reality is basically just stuff, just matter.
Yeah.
And thinkers like Bradley, they felt they needed to say there was more to the world than that.
Yeah.
Something beyond just, a bunch of atoms moving around.
Like he said, the colorless movement of atoms.
That's the phrase right there, yeah.
And they wanted to keep that idea that human life has meaning, like a deeper meaning.
Exactly. They thought that was crucial.
Okay, so that was a really important thing to them.
Yes, absolutely.
But Ward saw that this absolute idealism had some issues.
Yeah, he was a sharp guy.
Yeah.
And he saw some problems with it.
So if reality is just this seamless whole,
Right.
what happens to the individual self?
Yeah, where do I fit in if everything is just one big blob?
Right.
And if the absolute exists outside of time, what room is there for us to make choices to actually be free?
Right.
And if ultimate reality is perfect and already complete, how do we explain all the messed up stuff, all the bad things in our world?
Yeah, like the imperfection and the struggling and all of that.
The moral struggles we all face.
Exactly.
Big questions that absolute idealism didn't really answer.
And that's what Ward was trying to figure out.
Yeah, he wanted to find a way to make it all make sense.
He saw that idealism had some good points rejecting this purely mechanical universe.
Right, it wasn't just a bunch of gears and cogs.
Right, but he also saw that this idea of everything being one could maybe make individual beings less real.
Yeah, like we're just drops in the ocean.
And make our experiences less important.
Like they don't really matter in the grand scheme of things.
And that's really where Ward's big contribution comes in.
Right, where he tries to fix this.
Yeah, he tried to bring this idealistic view together with a view that says there are lots of real things.
Many different things existing all together.
And his solution was this idea of interacting monads,
Okay.
which he got from Leibniz but changed in important ways.
He borrowed the idea but put his own spin on it.
Right. So the goal for our deep dive today is to unpack this system that Ward built.
Yeah, let's take it apart and see how it works.
Yeah, we're going to look at his arguments against materialism and absolute idealism.
We'll see why he wasn't happy with either of those.
And then dive into his theory of these conative monads.
These beings defined by their striving and their desire.
And we're going to see how he used this to understand nature,
How the world around us works.
the mind,
What's going on in our heads.
and even God.
The big guy upstairs.
And basically why Ward's work, even though it's not super well known today,
Yeah, kind of faded into the background a bit.
might still have something to teach us.
It might be old, but it could still have some good ideas.
Exactly. So to get into it,
Right.
it helps to understand how Ward's thinking developed.
Yeah, where did these ideas come from?
So he was born into a family that was struggling financially,
Not a lot of money.
and he even had times without any real schooling.
Wow.
Yeah.
But no formal education for a while.
But that actually gave him a lot of time alone to think.
Oh, interesting. So it wasn't all bad.
And he really connected with nature.
Like he had the time and space to just observe the world around him.
And his daughter even talked about him wandering around the sandhills near Liverpool,
Okay.
just by himself with his thoughts and the seabirds.
That's a pretty powerful image.
Yeah, like a philosopher in the making.
Yeah, just contemplating the universe.
And at first he actually wanted to be a minister.
Really?
Yeah.
So a religious path?
Yeah, he went to Spring Hill College,
Okay.
but this is where he started having a religious crisis.
Oh, wow. So a big change of direction.
Yeah, and this led him to Germany.
Okay.
And this was really important because he met Rudolf Hermann Lotze in Göttingen.
Gotcha.
And it's probably through Lotze that Ward got into Leibniz and his theory of monads.
So Germany was a big turning point for him intellectually,
Huge.
exposing him to these new ideas that would become super important for his own philosophy.
But he still kept struggling with his faith even when he came back to England.
Oh, so the crisis didn't just go away?
No, and he even worked as a pastor for a bit in Cambridge.
But it sounds like he was still wrestling with these big questions.
Yeah, and it came to a head in 1872.
Okay.
And he actually quit being a minister and enrolled as a student at Cambridge.
Wow. So back to school.
Yeah, and it seems like going through all of that made him realize something.
Like it gave him some insight into himself.
Yeah, he said that human freedom might be more limited than we think.
It's interesting, especially for a philosopher who would go on to be so focused on freedom,
Right. But it makes sense because he said he learned this from experience, from struggling.
not just from thinking about it abstractly.
Yeah.
So real life was teaching him about these big philosophical concepts.
And even though he started his academic career kind of late, when he was 30,
Okay.
he was a really sharp guy.
He made up for lost time?
Yeah, he got top honors.
Wow.
And he won a fellowship for his work on how physiology and psychology are connected.
So the relationship between our bodies and minds.
Yeah, and he also got a lot of attention for his article on psychology for the Encyclopedia Britannica,
Oh, wow. A pretty big deal.
where he criticized associationist psychology.
Which was like the main way of thinking about psychology at the time, right?
Yeah, people like Mill and Bain were really into it.
Okay.
And then he gave these prestigious Gifford lectures in the late 1890s, which became his book, Naturalism and Agnosticism.
Catchy title.
And this gave him a chance to really challenge scientific materialism.
Which was a really popular view at the time, right?
Yeah, super popular in intellectual circles.
Okay.
And these lectures were super influential.
People really took notice.
Yeah, Alfred Edward Taylor called it like the best philosophical book of the year.
Wow, high praise.
Yeah. And he said Ward's arguments against materialism were really strong.
So he was taken seriously as a critic of this dominant viewpoint.
And it's cool to think about how G.E. Moore and Bertrand Russell were his students at Cambridge.
Oh, wow. So he taught two of the most important 20th century philosophers.
Yeah.
That's wild.
After he got appointed to this new chair of mental philosophy and logic,
Okay.
and Moore said that Ward was always like really engaged with ideas during his lectures.
So not just reading from a script, but actually thinking through things in real time.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And Russell remembered him with a lot of affection.
Oh, that's nice.
So it seems like he was a really good teacher.
Yeah, he made an impact on his students.
And he was clearly well respected because he got invited to give another series of Gifford lectures.
Really? So
Yeah.
a second time around.
Yeah, and those became his book, The Realm of Ends, or Pluralism and Theism.
Which is like his big statement on his own metaphysics.
Exactly.
Okay, so now we've got a good sense of his background.
Yeah.
Let's get into the details of his philosophy.
Okay, so first his critique of materialism.
Okay.
You mentioned that naturalism and agnosticism really lays out his objections.
Yeah, he goes into detail there.
What were his main problems with materialism?
Well, he argued that materialism says reality is basically just a bunch of particles,
Okay.
all following strict rules.
And that doesn't explain contingency, right?
Exactly. It doesn't leave any room for the fact that things could have been different.
Which is like a basic part of our experience, right?
Yeah, all the time we see that things could have gone another way.
And he's saying that a purely materialistic view just can't explain that.
Right, because everything's just set in motion from the beginning.
Like a clock.
Yeah.
So there's no real chance or unpredictability.
Not in that system.
And he also said that materialism can't really explain biology.
Right. How do you get life from non-life?
Yeah.
How do you get all this complexity and organization?
From just basic matter.
Yeah, it seems like you'd need something more,
And this was a big problem for him.
like a fundamental problem.
Yeah, he called it creatio ex nihilo.
Creating something from nothing.
which he didn't think was possible.
And his criticisms weren't just philosophical.
Okay.
He also looked at what was happening in science at the time,
Okay.
and he saw that the idea of the atom was changing.
Right.
It wasn't just this simple little particle anymore.
Yeah.
Physics was showing that it was more dynamic,
Yeah.
more complex.
And that kind of undermined the basis of materialism.
Right, the foundation was starting to crumble.
So for Ward, materialism wasn't just wrong, it was like a misunderstanding.
Yeah, a category error.
Yeah, he thought scientists were doing something wrong.
Not on purpose, but
Yeah.
he thought they were making a mistake.
Okay.
They were starting with abstract ideas, which is fine.
Okay.
That's how they make their theories and models.
Right.
But then they were confusing these abstract ideas with reality itself.
Like taking a map for the actual terrain.
Exactly.
So he was saying materialism was like a metaphysics of scientists who don't understand their own work.
Yeah, kind of a harsh criticism, but
But I see his point.
yeah, it's a good reminder that our models aren't always the same as reality.
And this is still relevant today, right?
Oh, absolutely. People are still talking about the limits of scientific reductionism.
So Ward wasn't happy with materialism.
Nope.
And he wasn't happy with absolute idealism either.
Not really.
What were his main problems with that one?
Well, he thought it didn't really explain anything.
Like it was explanatorily vacuous?
Yeah, exactly. It didn't make the world any clearer.
Okay.
The idea that all the different things we see are just appearances of this one big thing.
Yeah.
It didn't really tell us why things are the way they are.
Like, why does this one absolute thing appear as all these different things?
Right. Why does it even appear at all?
And why is the world so imperfect and fragmented?
Yeah. Why isn't it just a perfect blissful oneness?
Exactly. And Ward thought that absolute idealism just couldn't answer those questions.
Right. Just push the mystery back a step.
And he even pointed out that Bradley himself admitted this was a problem.
Yeah, Bradley talked about the fact of fragmentariness.
And how hard it was to explain.
Right. So even the big names in absolute idealism knew there was a problem there.
So Ward wasn't buying it.
Nope.
And he wasn't satisfied with just criticizing. He wanted to come up with his own solution.
Yeah, you wanted to find a better way.
And that's where Leibniz and the idea of monads comes in.
Right, so we're finally getting to Ward's own system now.
Exactly. So he saw Leibniz's monadology as a good starting point.
Okay.
But he thought it needed some changes.
Like some updates?
Yeah, especially when it came to the religious stuff.
Okay.
And the idea of pre-established harmony.
Ah, yes, the idea that God set everything up perfectly from the beginning.
So that all the monads would act in sync without actually interacting.
Like a perfectly choreographed dance.
Yeah.
But Ward had a problem with that.
Yeah, what was it?
Well, it seemed to get rid of any real chance or newness in the world.
Like everything was already predetermined.
Yeah, like a movie where you already know the ending.
And Ward, being into evolution, thought the world was all about new things emerging.
Like genuine creation.
Epigenesis.
Exactly. Things coming into being that weren't there before.
And he even saw this in Hegel's philosophy.
Really? Even though Hegel was an absolute idealist?
Yeah, he said there was this pluralistic undercurrent in Hegel.
Interesting.
Because Hegel talked about nature as being contingent and full of details.
Okay.
But Ward didn't agree with Hegel's idea that this was all just the unfolding of some pre-existing idea.
So he liked that Hegel saw the richness and detail of the world.
Yeah.
But he didn't like the idea that it was all predetermined.
So if Ward didn't think pre-established harmony was the answer, how did he think these monads were connected?
Yeah, good question.
Because Leibniz was against direct interaction between monads.
Yeah, he called it transient causation.
And he thought it was impossible.
Right.
What did Ward think about that?
Well, Ward actually disagreed with Leibniz on this point.
Okay.
Leibniz didn't like direct interaction
Right.
because of this idea of physical influx,
Okay.
which basically says that you can't have a property or an influence go from one thing to another
Okay.
without it existing in some weird in-between state.
Like a quality just floating around in the void?
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense.
Okay.
But Ward said Leibniz was making a mistake here.
Okay.
He was thinking of monads like they were just things,
Like billiard balls.
yeah, just passively receiving influences.
Okay.
But Ward's big move was to say that monads aren't things, they're subjects.
Okay.
They're centers of activity, they feel, they strive. They're like little persons.
So they're not just sitting there waiting for something to happen to them.
No, they're active agents.
And that changes everything, right?
Yeah, if they're subjects, then the idea of them interacting directly makes sense.
Because they're not just exchanging properties, they're influencing each other.
Right, it's like a conversation, not just a collision.
So Ward directly contradicted Leibniz.
Yeah, he went against the grain.
Leibniz said monads have no windows.
Right, like they're closed off from each other.
But Ward said all monads have windows.
He flipped a script.
Yeah, and that's a really important difference between them.
Absolutely. It's at the heart of Ward's whole system.
Okay, so if these windowed monads are always interacting,
Yeah.
how do we get order and regularity in the natural world?
Right. If everything's so chaotic, how come things aren't just random all the time?
Yeah, that seems like a challenge for any system that says there are lots of independent things.
It is a big challenge.
So how did Ward deal with that?
He used this cool analogy.
Okay.
Imagine a ton of people,
Okay.
each with their own desires and skills,
Okay.
and they all end up in this environment with lots of resources.
Like a philosophical island.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
At first, it's probably going to be pretty chaotic.
Yeah, everyone running around doing their own thing.
But over time, they'll start to form patterns.
Okay.
They'll figure out ways to work together,
Okay.
and they'll create a social structure with hierarchy and specialization.
So it's like a society emerging from chaos.
Exactly.
And to someone watching from the outside,
Yeah.
it would look like there's order and regularity.
Right. Like everyone has their place and their role.
Even though it all started from individual actions?
Exactly.
So is he saying that nature is like a society
yeah, basically.
made up of all these monads?
Right. Instead of just inert particles.
So even something like a rock,
Yeah.
which seems totally lifeless,
Yeah.
is actually a society of monads.
Right. They've just reached a point of balance.
It's like a modus vivendi.
Yeah, they figured out how to coexist peacefully.
And they seem static to us because they're not really changing much.
Yeah, they're in equilibrium.
Maybe because they're just used to interacting in a certain way.
Like they've fallen into a routine.
Or because they've gotten so stuck in their habits that they can't really change.
Like they're trapped in their own little world.
He talks about these restless, enterprising monads
Yeah.
versus the ones who are just content and passive.
Like the go-getters versus the couch potatoes.
And the less their environment changes and the simpler their needs are,
Yep.
the more predictable their behavior will seem.
Like they're just following a script.
And that gives us this illusion of mechanical causality.
Like they're just mindless machines.
But Ward's saying that even under the surface, there's still this activity, this striving.
Right, the will to live is still there.
And the more energetic monads, the ones that are really driven, they're the ones who are pushing for change and novelty.
They're the ones shaking things up.
And this connects back to Leibniz's idea of phenomena bene fundata.
Right, well-founded appearances.
So the physical objects we see,
Yeah,
they're not illusions.
they're real, but they're not the whole story.
Right, they're grounded in this underlying reality of interacting monads.
Right, so the table is real,
Yeah.
but it's not just a solid chunk of matter.
It's a society of little minds.
Exactly.
And this makes Ward both a metaphysical idealist and an epistemological realist.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, he thinks reality is fundamentally mental.
Okay, idealism.
But he also thinks our perceptions can give us real knowledge about the world.
Okay, realism.
So it's like our perceptions are mental,
Yeah,
but they're still pointing to something real.
that's a tricky balance.
Yeah, but it makes sense in his system.
I see.
And he even thought Kant might have agreed with this.
Interesting, because Kant is famous for saying we can't know the things in themselves.
Yeah, the noumena.
But Ward thought Kant might have been open to the idea that the reality behind appearances is mental.
So not material.
Right.
Okay, and this whole view of nature also changes how he thought about natural laws.
Yeah. How did he see those?
Well, he didn't think they were these eternal, unchangeable rules.
Okay.
He said they were statistical.
Like describing tendencies, not absolute laws.
Yeah, and they're based on the behavior of lots of monads.
Like a social law.
Yeah, and they're also a product of evolution.
So they change over time.
Yeah, they're not fixed forever.
Interesting.
And he compared this to Peirce's idea of effete mind.
Where habits become so ingrained they become like laws,
Yeah.
but they disagreed on a big point.
Yeah, what was it?
Tychism.
Yeah.
Peirce was all about absolute chance.
Okay.
But Ward thought that chance wasn't enough.
He thought there had to be something more.
Yeah, he thought the monads were always driven by internal motives.
Like they're striving for self-preservation and self-realization.
Exactly.
And even though that striving doesn't always follow strict rules,
Right.
it's not
Yeah.
random.
There's a purpose behind it.
So for Ward, the purpose, the teleology,
Yeah.
is what explains the mechanical order we see.
The conatus, the will to live, is driving everything.
And this brings us to Ward's philosophy of mind
Okay.
and his panpsychism.
The idea that everything has some kind of experience.
Yeah, he thought experience was everywhere.
Wow, a radical view.
And this was part of the big debates about panpsychism in the late 19th century,
Huh.
especially after Clifford's essay on the nature of things in themselves.
Which linked panpsychism to evolution,
Yeah, Clifford said that mind couldn't just pop up out of nowhere.
like out of inert matter,
So there had to be some kind of experience in matter itself.
even if it was really basic.
And Ward agreed with this.
Okay.
He thought evolution was more like a gradual increase in the potential for experience.
Not a sudden creation of consciousness.
Yeah, and he even said that the atom itself might have some potential for experience.
Wow.
But the source material points out something interesting.
What's that?
If evolution really does create new things,
Yeah, new properties.
then why is it so hard to believe that mind could emerge from matter?
That's a good point.
Maybe consciousness is just another one of those new things.
It's something to think about.
But even though Ward was into panpsychism, he didn't like Clifford's specific version of it.
What was Clifford's view?
He had this idea of mind stuff,
Okay.
these little bits of experience attached to atoms.
Like each atom has its own tiny piece of consciousness.
Yeah, and they combine to make more complex consciousness.
Okay, but Ward didn't like that idea.
No, he really criticized it.
What were his problems with it?
Well, first he said that Clifford assumed there was a one-to-one link between matter and experience.
Okay.
Like one atom equals one unit of experience.
But what if atoms aren't that simple?
What if they're more complex, like Kelvin's idea of the ether?
Then what happens to the mind stuff?
Right, it gets messy.
And second, Ward said that Clifford didn't understand the unity of consciousness.
Okay.
You can't just have these little pieces of mind dust floating around
Right.
and expect them to make a whole mind.
Like a mosaic.
Yeah, but Ward said that doesn't capture how integrated our experience is.
It's more than just the sum of its parts.
Exactly. And finally, he said that even if you accept mind stuff,
Clifford still hasn't explained how it becomes a unified mind.
right, how does it go from bits to a whole?
He didn't bridge the gap.
So Ward thought Clifford's theory had a lot of holes,
Yeah.
but he thought his own theory of monads did a better job.
Okay. How so?
Well, he said the connection between mind and body isn't this simple one-to-one thing.
Okay.
It's more like Leibniz's idea of confused perception,
Okay.
where experiences belong to unified monads.
Okay.
And each monad has lots of little unconscious perceptions, but they're not separate bits of consciousness.
They're all part of the monad's whole experience.
Exactly. And he also saw the mind-body relationship as hierarchical,
Okay.
not like the whole and its parts.
But like a leader and its followers.
Yeah, the mind is a dominant monad,
Okay.
and the body is made up of subordinate monads.
And they're all interacting within this bigger monadic society.
Right.
And the mind grows and develops through interaction with other monads.
So it's a social process.
Yeah.
No mysterious leaps from dust to consciousness.
So he thought Leibniz's framework with some tweaks
Yeah.
was a better way to understand mind and body than Clifford's mind stuff.
He thought it was more coherent.
But even Ward's theory has some loose ends.
Oh, yeah. What are those?
Well, if we're directly aware of the monads in our body,
Yeah.
why aren't we aware of our individual neurons?
That's a good question.
And how does the dominant monad actually control the subordinate monads?
Yeah. What's the mechanism?
And what about space itself?
Right. If monads are spiritual, how do they interact in space?
Ward didn't really answer these questions.
So there's still room for more thinking there,
Yeah, it shows how hard it is to come up with a complete theory of mind.
even for someone as smart as Ward.
Oh.
Okay, so let's move on to his natural theology.
His view of God.
Yeah. How did evolution influence his thinking about God?
Well, he was upfront about the fact that you can't really prove God's existence.
Okay.
But he said that a world with just monads,
Right.
without God, would be kind of meaningless.
Like all this striving for nothing?
Yeah, a Sisyphean task. So he thought God was necessary to give the universe direction,
And to make sure that all this striving could lead to something good.
like greater harmony and value.
Exactly.
But he didn't think God was just another monad.
Right. He wasn't just the biggest fish in the pond.
Yeah, he thought God was transcendent.
Totally beyond the created world.
Yeah, the ratio ascendi of the world.
The reason for its existence.
But God also had to be immanent.
Involved in the world.
Yeah, otherwise how could he guide the monads?
Right. He can't be a detached observer.
So how did Ward balance these two?
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
He used the analogy of a cosmic artist
Yeah.
who puts himself into his artwork,
Okay.
lives in it, loves it.
But he admitted this was just an analogy.
Yeah. A way to try and grasp something that's ultimately beyond our understanding.
And what's really interesting is how he tried to fit God into his idea of epigenesis
Yeah, how do you have a God who creates new things?
and also allows for real freedom.
That's a tricky one.
So he came up with this idea that God limits his own power to give the monads freedom.
So he's not controlling everything.
No, he's stepping back to let them create.
Wow, that's a radical idea.
And he even said, unless creators are created, nothing is really created.
So he's saying that real creation requires freedom.
And this meant he had to reject the traditional idea of God knowing everything.
Omniscience.
Yeah, at least when it came to the future.
Because if the monads are truly free,
Yeah.
God can't know what they're going to do.
But he still knows the possibilities.
Right, he knows what they're capable of.
And he knows the general tendencies.
So he's not surprised by what happened.
But he's not in total control either.
And this means that God is, in a way, a developing being.
His knowledge grows as the universe unfolds.
That's a really different view of God.
Yeah, very different from the traditional one.
But it makes sense if you believe in real freedom.
So how does this God actually guide the world if he's not controlling everything?
Yeah, that's the big question.
And Ward was honest about not having all the answers.
He said the modus operandi is inscrutable.
Like it's a mystery.
We can't fully grasp how God works.
Okay, so what about Ward's legacy?
Yeah, how did his ideas influence other philosophers?
Well, it seems like his direct impact wasn't huge,
Not like some other big names.
but he was influential at Cambridge in the early 20th century,
Okay.
especially on Bertrand Russell.
Even though Russell later criticized him.
He called Ward